that Christ came to save sinners, to incorporate them into his kingdom, achieving forgiveness for them and their redemption. To forgive is to condemn the fault, but to spare the doer. If you could have God write one chapter about anything in the Bible, what topic would you have him write on? Would you have him write a chapter on parenting and maybe how to navigate the complexities of the modern world with your kids? In an election year, would you want him to write a passage or a chapter on who to vote for and why to vote for them or who not to vote for? Or would you have him write a chapter on how to find the career that really fits you, or how to choose the major for college that will lead you to a great life and would help you to thrive as a person in the rest of your life? Well, God didn't devote a chapter to those things, did he? Now, I'm not saying that God doesn't care about those things or that he doesn't think those things are important, but it's important for us to know that God doesn't devote a chapter of the Bible to any of those particular issues, but he did give us this one chapter book, Obadiah. God did not see fit to include a chapter in his word on any of those other topics of elections or parenting that we maybe would have wanted him to include, but he did see fit for us to receive the book of Obadiah. There are only 4 one-chapter books in the entire Bible, and Obadiah is the only one of the 39 books of the Old Testament. So why this chapter? Why this prophet? Why this oracle of judgment toward this particular nation? Well, that's what we are going to find out together this morning. As we look at Obadiah, the big idea of this passage is that Christians must show grace to everyone because God's purpose in judgment is ultimately restoration. But the problem that this passage faces us with is that we think that God's judgment negates his character. And we come to find that God's purpose in judgment is ultimately restoration when we see the surety of his justice, the scope of his justice, and the aim of his justice. The first one, the surety of his justice. Looking at the first 14 verses of the book, we see in verses 1 through 9 a proclamation of divine judgment against Edom. And in verses 10 through 14, we see the cause of that divine judgment against Edom. The book begins immediately, and we get no background info on Obadiah other than the fact that he is a prophet who has received an oracle from God. The name Obadiah means the servant of the Lord, with the Hebrew Obed, meaning servant, and the Hebrew word for the latter half spelling the covenantal name of God. And so this servant of God gives an oracle of God concerning the people of Edom, and we're right into it. The people of Edom were a people whom we are introduced to way back in the book of Genesis, as they are descendants of Esau. If you remember that part of the Bible, beginning in Genesis 25, you would remember the twins, Jacob and Esau, the sons of Isaac being born. And you would remember that Jacob and Esau, even in the womb of their mother, are at war with each other. And you remember that as Jacob is making lentil stew, that his hunter-gatherer brother Esau comes in and is starving, and he sells his birthright to Jacob. Upon his return, he sells his birthright, and this leads to just continued bitterness and resentment and hatred from one brother to the other and vice versa. See, this relationship of Jacob deceiving Esau and Esau responding in anger would continue throughout the Old Testament. God gives us a preview. He says that these nations will come from these two men, from Israel and Edom, and they will be at war with each other. And throughout the Old Testament, again and again and again, we see this contention between these two nations and these two brothers. So here, Israel was facing judgment by God for breaking the covenant that he had made with them. He promised that if they ran after other gods and idols and other nations, that they would in return would be overthrown by those nations. And that's exactly what has happened here. But Edom, the brother of Israel, stood idly by and even participated in the sacking of the southern kingdom. And so in return for their action and their inaction toward their brother, God would bring a swift judgment upon the Edomites. It's as if God is rebuking the one son while the other son is standing by and mocking his brother and egging his dad on while he rebukes his brother. But while the brother is mocking him and while he is cheering his dad on, the dad turns to the brother and says, "Stop it, that is your brother." This is what God is doing with Edom. The prophecy describes the people of Edom being brought from their great heights to being in the lowest possible of lows. See, we've heard a report from the Lord. He will make you small among the nations. You shall be utterly despised. Though you soar aloft like the eagle, though your nest is among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord. The eagle was, and still really is, the king of birds, right? It's an awesome bird. It's a symbol of power and strength. When my wife and I first got married, we had the opportunity of going to Austria and Germany as part of our honeymoon. And there we found ourselves in a small town in Germany called Berchtesgaden. It's a small town that rests on the base of the Alps, but it's a town that is now famous for a base and a structure that was built on the top of one of those mountains. And that is a place where Adolf Hitler made his residence, where he made a lot of his planning before the Second World War was made there in that place above Berchtesgaden. And it was that place that he called the Eagle's Nest. It was from there, that place, that he would plot and he would plan to rule over the nations, and he would plan and plot genocide, and he would exalt himself above all, but that ultimately only resulted in his demise and destruction. So in the same way, Edom, which had raised itself above other nations, and which quite literally was located on a hill, though their nest was among the stars, the Lord declares that he would bring them down from their glorious heights. The oracle continues by describing the complete and utter destruction that is to come for Edom, where thieves and grape gatherers only take some. In Edom's case, they will lose everything. This is also seen in the way that God speaks directly to Edom in verses 5 and 7, but speaks about Edom in verses 6 and 8 as if Edom no longer exists. It's amazing. The high and mighty Edom, brought to ruin along with its great leaders and kings, overrun by surrounding nations, just as their brother Israel was, but to an even greater degree. Then we get a better picture at what it is that Edom was actually guilty of. In verses 10 through 14, God says this: "Because of the violence done to your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you. And you shall be cut off forever. On the day that you stood aloof, on the day that strangers carried off his wealth, and foreigners entered his gates, and cast lots for Jerusalem, you were like one of them." And then begins a series of 8 different do nots. "But do not gloat over the day of your brother in the day of his misfortune. Do not rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their ruin. Do not boast in the day of distress. Do not enter the gate of my people in the day of their calamity, and do not gloat over his disaster in the day of his calamity. Do not loot his wealth in the day of his calamity. Do not stand at the crossroads to cut off his fugitives, and do not hand over his survivors in the day of distress." See, it is the Lord who it is God who is the Lord over all things. It is God who does not and cannot lie, whose word is his doing, that promises this judgment. And if it is he whose word is his doing promises this judgment, then surely it will come to pass. This is a sure and final judgment that is to come. Now, many of us in the West struggle with these types of passages. We struggle with these passages, particularly in the Minor Prophets. I feel like that's part of why we tend to not really know about the Minor Prophets, is we kind of knowingly turn a blind eye to them. But for people groups throughout world history who have suffered real oppression and violence at the hands of others, this passage is a great comfort. This passage is seen as a good thing, whereas we might see it more problematic. They would see it as a good thing, that God would step in, that he would mediate, and that he would bring down those who oppress others. This is why the Minor Prophets, whose main theme, one of the main themes, is justice, was so heavily leaned upon by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and others during the Civil Rights Movement. This is why Frederick Douglass and others leaned upon this passage during the abolitionist movement. They longed for real justice to be done and knew that this God, that the God of the Bible, whose word is his doing, would deliver that for them. And so God promises to do justice for his people who have been wronged, and because he promises it, he will do it. But it doesn't end there. We come to find that God's purpose in judgment is ultimately restoration, when not only we see the surety of his judgment, but also the scope of his judgment. Verse 15, "For the day of the Lord is near upon all the nations. As you have done, it shall be done to you. Your deeds shall return on your own head. For as you have drunk on my holy mountain, so all the nations shall drink continually. They shall drink and swallow, and shall be as though they had never been. But in Mount Zion there will be those who escape, and it shall be holy. And the house of Jacob shall possess their possessions. The house of Jacob shall be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame, and the house of Esau a stubble. They shall burn them and consume them, and there shall be no survivor for the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken." See, this section begins with the day of the Lord. The thing with the minor prophets is we know them as a collection of 12 books. They're known actually as the 12 because they are intended to be read together. Throughout the book, the theme of the day of the Lord is seen time and time and time again. And in fact, it's already happened in Joel and Amos. The day of the Lord is a day to come when the Lord would return to defeat chaos and to defeat the powers in opposition to himself. But the day of the Lord is a day that not only has to do with others being punished, it also has to do with God's own people in their rebellion being punished. Just as Edom was tempted to see the sacking of Jerusalem as an invitation to sin against their brother and to join in on the fun, so Israel would have been tempted to see this condemnation of Edom in the same way. The temptation would be to read Obadiah, to pencil in others that we don't like for Edom, and to put ourselves over them and to say, see, God punished Edom because they're worthless, and he's going to do the same with you. I was tempted to title this sermon, Edom is toast and so are you, right? But I didn't do that. Just as some may see God's justice and think that that negates his character, that maybe it is an awful and unjust thing that he would be a just God, so the people of God often make the mistake of seeing God's justice and think that somehow that negates how we respond to others and treat others. That somehow that opens the door for how we can treat and look down upon other people. This is where the scope of God's judgment being seen is so important, because up to this point, the focus has been entirely on Edom. But here the shift happens in the text. It's a subtle shift that says the day of the Lord is near upon what? All nations. As the day of the Lord is spoken of here, we need to be reminded of the fact that the day of the Lord, after that day, Joel says that God would save all who would call upon his name. That after that day in Amos, that God says that he would restore his kingdom. He would include all nations, including Edom, amongst his people and call them to himself. As Edom has drank at Israel's judgment, so Edom will drink the cup of wrath from God. And so as Edom drinks God's judgment, so the nations will drink the cup of wrath as well. See, this is important because it shows us that Obadiah is not merely about Edom. Edom is merely serving as a paradigm for God's judgment in the world. See, in the midst of it all, God's covenantal people, they will be saved. They who were once refugees will be given a home and given protection. In the midst of the great destruction that is to come, a remnant would be plucked out and would be saved. But this leaves us with a question. If God's own people, Israel, had broken the covenant, which led to their exile, and the people of Edom had sinned against Israel, and if the nations will one day drink the same judgment that Edom is going to be drinking, then who will be left? But this passage gives us a picture of complete and utter destruction. So who could possibly survive that destruction? Who could possibly withstand the day of the Lord? And that's the answer that these final three verses give to us. Because we not only see the purpose in God's judgment ultimately being restoration in the scope of his judgment, in the surety of his judgment, but we also see it in the aim of his justice. Beautifully, the book ends this way. Those of the Negev shall possess Mount Esau, and those of the Shephelah shall possess the land of the Philistines. They shall possess the land of Ephraim, and the land of Samaria, and Benjamin shall possess Gilead. The exiles of this host of the people of Israel shall possess the land of the Canaanites as far as Zarephath. And the exiles of Jerusalem, who are in Sepharad, shall possess the cities of the Negev. Saviors shall go up to Mount Zion to rule Mount Esau, and the kingdom shall be the Lord's. As the oracle comes to a close, we get a picture of profound hope. So far, we have seen sprinkles of hope throughout, but here we get a picture of God going a step further and doing justice, or a step further than just doing justice on their behalf. He takes it even further. In these 3 verses, we are given a map of Israel. The Negev, the Shephelah, and Benjamin are regions in the center of Israel. Mount Esau is in the south. The land of the Philistines is in the west. Ephraim and Samaria are in the north. Gilead is in the east. Zarephath is far north. And Sepharad is a land that's very far away. So those from the south, the west, the north, the far away lands somewhere out there, and at the center would be delivered and restored. Just as Joel and Amos also prophesied. Saviors will go up to Mount Zion to rule Mount Esau, or Edom, and would rule from there. So not only is Obadiah giving us Edom as the prototype of God's judgment, he's also giving us Edom as a picture of a people who represent the aim of God's judgment, which is restoration. Within a couple hundred years of this, Edom would no longer actually be a nation. They would be overthrown. So God decimating their kingdom and bringing it to ruin would certainly come to fruition. But although God would bring their kingdom to ruin, and he would ensure that they would no longer have the power and the leaders that they once had, here, God says they may not belong to a kingdom anymore as they once had, but instead they will belong to ours. They will belong to mine. The policy of God's judgment is not a scorched earth policy, because here we get a taste of the reality that even Edom would be brought into and incorporated into the family of God. You see, it's not just a restoration of the people of God at the center. It is a restoration of them, but a restoration also of those from the nations. That those from every tribe, tongue, and nation would come to know the true and living God. You see why God chose to give us Obadiah and not any of those other chapters that we would prefer for him to give us? But how would God do this? How would God bring people, including Edom, from every tribe, tongue, and nation into his own kingdom? How would we restore his people, let alone the nations who have willingly drank his cup of judgment? Well, just over 500 years after this oracle, we get our answer. It's Christ who would come. Just as Edom is condemned here for both standing idly by and participating in the destruction of Judah, so Christ's people stood idly by, denied him, and participated in his crucifixion in the day of his calamity and distress. And yet, it was the plan of God for this to occur, and it was the Son of God who willingly took this suffering on his own shoulders. Why? So that those at the center, and the north, and the east, and the west, and the south, and the faraway places would be saved. That's why. Obadiah gives us the aim of God's judgment, which is ultimately restoration. It is in his judgment against Edom and all the nations of the world that we are led to the great truth of the gospel. That Christ came to save sinners, to incorporate them into his kingdom, and to do so by taking the justice due to them onto his own shoulders in the person of Christ, achieving forgiveness for them and their redemption. You see, one theologian puts the difference between justice and forgiveness this way. He says the difference between justice and forgiveness, to be just is to condemn the fault, and because of the fault, to condemn the doer as well. To forgive is to condemn the fault, but to spare the doer. That's what the forgiving does. It is Christ who drank the cup of wrath so that you and I would be spared. It is Christ who willingly was the brother who was overrun by his brothers and destroyed by them for our sake. And he did that so that you would find forgiveness and life and redemption and protection in him forever. So you who are from the north, the south, the east, the west, and from the faraway places would know him and would be with him. We see that God's purpose in judgment is ultimately restoration when we see the surety of his justice, the scope of his justice, and the aim of his justice, which is to save sinners. Please pray with me.